Welcome to Bedtime Empires, where history's darkest tales come alive in vivid detail. Tonight, we journey through the most horrific torture methods of the ancient world, from savage rituals to brutal punishments designed to break body and spirit. Prepare yourself for a chilling yet captivating exploration of human cruelty across civilizations and centuries. So, get comfortable, relax, and let the stories unfold. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and what time it is. Let's begin. The most horrific torture methods of the ancient world. The sky above Babylon burned with the color of molten bronze as the sun dipped low behind the towers. From the tall stone walls of the ziggurat, a procession wound its way through the dusty city street, soldiers in lamellar armor, priests in white linen, and behind them, a cart drawn by oxen. Bound to its wooden frame, arms stretched outward like a starfish crucified by fate, was a man whose screams had long since given way to ragged breathing. His name was Sharat, accused of stealing temple offerings, gold beads meant for Ishtar, the queen of heaven. He was innocent. The high priest had ordered a punishment so brutal, so ancient, that even the city's elders whispered about it with reverence and fear: the flaying of the living. On a raised platform before the temple gates, the executioner, his face obscured by a veil of reed, fibers stepped forward with knives forged from obsidian. The ritual began at the back of the neck, with the smallest incision, and ended hours later when the skin of the man lay folded like a discarded robe at his feet. The crowd had gathered not for justice, but spectacle. Children clung to their mothers' robes, merchants stood in silence, and scribes recorded the act with solemn precision. This was not cruelty without purpose. This was a message. The Babylonian court believed that the body housed not only the soul, but the memory of sin. To strip the flesh was to strip away the offense in the eyes of the gods. Pain was purification. Suffering was a form of divine bookkeeping. And yet, the truth that would never be carved into stone tablets was this: the powerful used torture not just for punishment, but for control. And they were not alone. Across the world, from the icy tundra of Scythia to the golden palaces of Egypt, from the forums of Rome to the blood-slicked altars of the Aztecs, humans had created instruments and rituals of torment so ingenious, so elaborate, that they defied belief. They were built not only to destroy the body, but to unravel the mind. This is their story. In the arid hills of Persia, under the reign of King Cambyses II, there was a punishment so grotesque that even the court chroniclers wrote of it with trembling hands. It was called scaphism, or, more cruelly, the boats. A shallow wooden canoe was hollowed to fit the shape of a man. Another identical canoe was placed on top, leaving the arms, legs, and head exposed. The victim, often a traitor, or someone accused of blaspheming the divine king, was locked inside. Then came the milk and honey. The executioners poured it down the prisoner's throat until he could no longer breathe without choking. They smeared it on his face, his arms, his genitals. Every soft patch of skin was coated. Then the boats were dragged into a stagnant pond and left to float. At first, it seemed a strange form of exile. But as the days passed, the truth revealed itself. Flies arrived, then maggots, then disease. The man inside would scream as insects laid eggs in his wounds, as the sun blistered his skin and hunger warped his mind. He would defecate himself, vomit, cry, and still live. Some victims lasted for over a week, long enough to be forgotten by their enemies, but not by death. The Persians believed that the gods watched even in decay, that true guilt required suffering without end, and so scaphism endured, passed in whispers from one fearful dynasty to the next. Not even the Greeks, with all their learning, dared replicate it. But across the sea, the Romans had their own inventions. In the heart of the Roman Republic, beneath the grandeur of marble pillars and the echo of Senate speeches, torture was not only practiced, it was codified. Crucifixion was not Roman in origin, but the empire perfected it. It was reserved for slaves, traitors, and the worst of criminals, those who, in Rome's eyes, had challenged the sanctity of law and dominion. The process was theatrical, brutal, and excruciatingly slow. Victims were stripped naked and scourged with a flagruma whip tipped with bits of bone and metal. The skin tore open like parchment. Then came the beam, the patibulum, heavy and rough-hewn, carried on bruised shoulders through the city's roads while crowds jeered and spat. At the place of execution, often outside the city gates, the upright post awaited. The condemned was laid atop the cross. Nails, not ropes, were driven through wrists and ankles, not to bleed them to death, but to fix them in agony. Hanging there, body twisted by gravity and exhaustion, death came not quickly, but by suffocation. Each breath required a push upward on shattered feet. Every movement was fire through the nerves. It could take days to die. Rome liked it that way. It was punishment, yes, but more than that. It was theater, a warning, a public message carved in flesh. No one is greater than the state. And yet, as cruel as crucifixion was, it was not Rome's darkest invention. That belonged to the bronze bull of Phalaris. It was on the island of Sicily, in the Greek city of Acragas, where one of the most sinister torture devices in human history was conceived, the bronze bull. The tyrant Phalaris ruled with cunning and cruelty. His wealth was immense, his spies everywhere, and his taste for innovation, especially in suffering, was unmatched. One day, a metalsmith named Perillos came before the court with a gift, one he claimed would bring both terror and art to the ruler's reign. It was a statuette, life-sized bull, cast entirely in bronze, polished to a mirror finish, but it was hollow. A small, latched door opened on its side. Perillos explained that a man could be placed inside, alive, and a fire set beneath the belly. The bull would heat, slowly. The man inside would burn. But that was not all. The head of the bull was carefully engineered with a series of pipes and baffles. As the victim screamed, their cries would be transformed by the internal channels into the bellowing sound of an enraged beast. The bull would come alive with each wail of agony. Phalaris was impressed, too impressed. He ordered Perillos to demonstrate the device, and when the smith proudly climbed inside to show how the acoustics would work, the tyrant locked the door behind him. "Let us see if your creation sings," Phalaris said, as the flames were lit. Smoke rose. The bull groaned. The court listened as Perillos screamed. His voice warped into a monstrous roar. His body cooked alive inside the belly of his own invention. That night, the people of Acragas said they heard the bull moan beneath the stars, long after the fire had died. Later, Phalaris would be overthrown, and legend has it he too was executed in the same bull. The device would vanish from history, but the idea of turning pain into spectacle would echo into later centuries. Meanwhile, far to the east, another empire had perfected a quieter crueltion that broke not only the body, but the spirit. In ancient China, during the later Han dynasty, torture was not a crude tool, it was a systemized extension of the imperial code. There was no need for public gore when precision and bureaucracy could destroy a person far more efficiently. One method, known as lingqi, or death by 1,000 cuts, was reserved for the worst crimes: treason, patricide, and sacrilege. The victim was tied upright to a wooden frame in a public square, surrounded by soldiers and scribes. Executioners were trained not to kill quickly, but to keep the condemned alive through a choreographed series of small incisions over hours, even days. The first cuts targeted the fleshier parts: arms, thighs, buttocks, then the face, then the chest. Muscles peeled away like bark. The heart was saved for last. Observers often reported that some victims remained conscious through more than 100 cuts. But the cruelty was not only physical. Before lingqi, the accused's family could be stripped of titles, homes, and honor. Their name would be erased from ancestral records. In a culture that revered lineage and spiritual continuation, this was a fate worse than death: obliteration. For the imperial court, this was justice wrapped in ceremony. But not all Chinese torture was so methodical. Earlier dynasties, particularly under the Qin, had used brutal instruments like the tiger bench, where victims' legs were bound on a plank and bricks were stacked under the ankles, slowly forcing the knees to snap backward. Others were boiled alive. Others had their bodies torn by chariots pulling in opposite directions. Pain, in the East, wore many faces but always beneath the banner of order and the ever-watchful eye of the emperor. And yet even these horrors paled in comparison to the sacred, blood-drenched rites of another empire won high in the mountains of Mesoamerica, where hearts were ripped from living chests in offerings to the gods. The sun rose crimson over Tenochtitlan, reflecting off the surface of Lake Texcoco like a pool of blood. On the day of the ritual, the Great Pyramid of the Templo Mayor stood draped in flowers, painted with sacrificial chalk, and steeped in the odor of burning copal and sweat. Drums thundered like the heartbeat of a god. It was time for the offering. The Aztec Empire, at the height of its power, believed the universe ran not on physics or chance but on sacrifice. The sun itself, Huitzilopochtli, required nourishment in the form of blood to continue its daily rise. Without it, the world would end in darkness. At the top of the temple, 4 priests held down the arms and legs of the prisoner. The man was young, captured in war, chosen for strength and beauty. He was not a criminal, but a gift. His chest heaved with terror and pride. The high priest raised a ceremonial obsidian blade, honed sharper than steel, and plunged it into the chest with surgical precision. In one swift motion, he cut through muscle and bone, reached in, and pulled out the still-beating heart. The crowd below roared. The body was then kicked down the steep stairs, limbs flailing, bouncing against stone until it reached the bottom, where it would be skinned, butchered, or cast into the sacred canals. The Aztecs called it Tlacaxepehualistli, the flaying of Menand. It was part of a greater cycle. The flayed skin might be worn by dancers, symbolizing rebirth and fertility. The blood was not wasted, it was destiny made manifest. What made these sacrifices so chilling was not the brutality alone, but their beauty. The ceremonies were adorned with brilliant feathered costumes, golden ornaments, poetry, and music. For the Aztecs, death in sacrifice was not defeated, was transcendence. The victims, in a dark way, were honored. They became the food of the gods. But elsewhere in the world, sacrifice was not holy. It was designed purely to destroy. The Vlad the Impaler, for instance, had no use for rituals-only warnings. In the deep forests of 15th-century Wallachia, where the Carpathian mists crawled through pine trees and wolves howled at dusk, a figure ruled with a name whispered in terror: Vlad III, Dracula better known as Vlad the Impaler. His preferred method of punishment was not just execution, it was a performance of dread. Impalement, in his hands, became both an art and a psychological weapon. A sharpened wooden stake, thick and rough, was driven not through the chest but slowly, with dreadful patience, through the lower abdomen or rectum, avoiding vital organs. The victim was hoisted upright, gravity doing its grim work, the stake pushing deeper through the body until it emerged from the shoulder, chest, or mouth. Death could take hours, sometimes days. Vlad would often line entire roads with impaled bodies, hundreds at a time. Merchants, prisoners of war, political enemies, even his own nobles. The sight was so terrifying that entire invading armies reportedly turned back upon seeing it. To Vlad, terror was rule. It's said that once, when Ottoman envoys refused to remove their turbans in his court, he ordered them nailed to their skulls. "So you may never take them off again," he said coldly. Was he mad? Perhaps. But his methods kept stronger enemies at bay for years. Even the most brutal kings of Europe feared him. And yet, impalement was not his invention. The Assyrians used it. The Byzantines knew of it. But Vlad embraced it with a fervor unmatched in history. Still, not all torture was imperial or ritualistic. Some took root in darkness in dungeons, in cellars, in inquisitorial chambers where cruelty wore the robes of religion. And nowhere was this truer than during the medieval Inquisition. In the cold stone vaults of medieval Europe, beneath the torchlit cathedrals and monastic orders, a shadow moved with the blessing of the Church. It was the time of the Inquisition, and the aim was purity of faith achieved, not through persuasion, but through confession. And confessions, more often than not, were drawn from the human body like sap from a tree, slowly, painfully. The tools of the inquisitors were as varied as they were monstrous. One of the most feared was the rack. A victim would be bound, wrists and ankles tied to rotating rollers at each end of a wooden frame. With each turn of the handle, their body would stretch, ligaments tearing, shoulders dislocating, tendons snapping like ropes pulled taut beyond their limit. The screams that echoed through the cloisters were not proof of sin, but of submission. Then there was the strappado, an almost elegant device in its simplicity. The accused was hoisted by their arms, tied behind their back, and dropped from a height. The weight of the fall would wrench the shoulders from their sockets, sometimes breaking the collarbone, the rib cage, or the spine. If they survived the first drop, the process was repeated. Water torture was common too. A cloth would be shoved into the mouth, and water poured endlessly, drowning the victim in slow, gasping, agonized water cure, as it was called. The most perverse irony of the Inquisition was that the torturers saw themselves not as cruel but as healers of souls. They believed pain could bring clarity, and that confession, even forced, was an act of spiritual salvation. After all, a lie under torture could still lead to repentance. But many did not survive to confess. The Iron Virgin, or Iron Maiden, was a later invention, possibly more legend than reality, but its reputation alone filled cells with terror. A coffin-shaped device lined with spikes, it would close upon the body slowly, impaling without striking vital organs immediately. Whether real or imagined, the fear it inspired was very much alive. Inquisitorial torture was systematic, legal, and sanctified. But elsewhere, in the Scandinavian North, cruelty took on a more primal, myth-soaked shape where punishment wasn't about confession, but sheer, inescapable dread. There, they called it the blood eagle. The blood eagle is perhaps the most horrific execution attributed to the Norsemen, though scholars still debate whether it was real or ritualized myth. But the Vikings were a people of saga, and this story endured across generations with bone-chilling detail. According to the legends, the blood eagle was reserved for traitors, those who broke oaths or murdered kin. The condemned would be restrained, face down, and the executioner, often a chieftain or warrior of renown, would begin by slicing open the back along the spine. With practiced hands, the ribs were cracked and pulled outward, forming a grotesque set of wings. Then the lungs were extracted and draped over the exposed ribs, fluttering faintly like bloody feathers as the victim gasped for air, still alive. For a time, it was said that if the victim made no sound, they earned honor in the afterlife. But what kind of honor lay beyond such pain? Whether fact or saga, the imagery of the blood eagle persists because it speaks to a deeper horror, the idea of a body unmade, transformed by cruelty into something unrecognizable. The Norse may have celebrated this torment as a message. This is the price of betrayal. But as Christianity spread, even these ancient punishments would be supplanted by more civilized forms of execution, public hangings, beheadings, and branding. And yet, the medieval world would find a way to continue inventing. In 17th century England, hanging, drawing, and quartering became the preferred method of punishing high treason, a sentence so excruciating it redefined state cruelty. In the gray, rain-slicked streets of Tudor England, treason was considered not merely a crime against the crown, but a spiritual and moral rot, deserving of the most excruciating end imaginable. To be hanged, drawn, and quartered was not just to DA, was to be publicly obliterated, body and soul. The sentence began with a drag, the condemned, tied to a wooden hurdle and pulled through the streets by horse to the place of execution. Mud caked their limbs. Rotten food, stones, and insults rained from the crowd. This humiliation was the prologue, a reminder to all watching. You were no longer human. Then came the hanging, but not to death. The rope would suspend the victim just long enough for strangulation to begin, for the body to convulse, and for hope to flicker. Then they were cut down. Still alive, they were stripped and disemboweled. The executioner, blade in hand, opened the abdomen with deliberate care. The intestines were drawn out, sometimes burned before the prisoner's eyes. The genitals were often removed, hacked away as both punishment and spectacle. Finally, the heart was torn from the chest sometimes, while it still beat. It would be held aloft for the crowd. And then, only then, came the quartering. The body chopped into 4 parts, each limb severed and displayed on spikes or gates around the kingdom. Heads were impaled on the walls of London Bridge, their jaws often stuffed with parchment bearing their name, or their treason. This was not just execution, it was theater. Kings like Edward I and Henry VIII used this method not only to eliminate enemies, but to instill generational terror. Even whispers of rebellion were enough to risk this fate. It was effective. But across the world, in feudal Japan, another form of calculated pain emerged steeped in shame, honor, and silence. It was called seppuku. Seppuku, also known in the West as harakiri, was not a punishment imposed by the state. It was a ritual suicide, practiced by samurai to preserve honor in the face of disgrace, capture, or failure. But make no mistake, it was a torture of exquisite control. The ritual was precise. The samurai would bathe, don white robes, and compose a final poem called a jiseis, a farewell to life. In front of witnesses, sometimes in a quiet garden or within a temple courtyard, he would kneel upon a tatami mat, a short ceremonial bladatanto or wakizashi placed before him. With deliberate resolve, he would plunge the blade into his lower abdomen and slice across the belly from left to right, then upward tearing through muscle and viscera. The pain was unimaginable, but it was endured in silence. Any scream, any collapse before the ritual was complete, was considered shameful. To end his suffering, a kaishakunin II, often a trusted friend, stood behind him, sword in hand. At the right moment, the kaishakunin would deliver a swift and clean decapitation to preserve the dying samurai's dignity. But not all seppuku was voluntary. In the late shogunate period, judicial seppuku became a sentence imposed on disgraced officials. Some were forced into it in public ceremonies, where nobles watched with calm detachment as the condemned cut themselves open in obedience. In its purest form, seppuku was not an act of violence but of resolve. It was a final statement of control in a world where status, loyalty, and reputation mattered more than breath. Yet outside the samurai class, the shoguns and emperors devised far crueler ends for traitors and criminals. Burning, boiling, and crucifixion all were used. Japan, like every empire before it, knew how to break a body. But not all torture was for justice. Some was for sport. And in the Roman Colosseum, suffering became entertainment. The sun rose high above the blood-stained sands of the Colosseum, casting golden light on 0 spectators, eager for the thrill of death. Rome, in all its majesty, was built on discipline, order, and terror. And in no place was that terror more publicly displayed than in its amphitheaters. Here, torture was theater, and cruelty was applauded. While gladiatorial combat is often romanticized, many of these battles were not contests between trained fighters, but spectacles of human suffering. Criminals, prisoners of war, slaves known as naxiai were thrown into the arena, often unarmed, to face trained killers, wild beasts, or elaborate tortures constructed purely for audience amusement. One of the most sadistic forms was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. The condemned were chained, sometimes dressed in animal skins, and released into the arena to be torn apart by lions, tigers, bears, or even leopards. The audience cheered as limbs were mangled and blood sprayed across the sand. But this was just the beginning. Roman ingenuity turned execution into elaborate performance. In some cases, victims were crucified, in the arena not simply nailed to crosses, but posed in grotesque tableaus mimicking scenes from mythology. One man might be bound to resemble Prometheus, while a vulture picked at his liver. Another might be cast as Icarus, dropped from scaffolding to his death. These were called fatal charadisrial death, played out as symbolic drama. And then there were fire-based punishments. Criminals were sometimes burned alive, not simply by flame, but by being enclosed in bronze statues modeled as bulls or gods. Fires were lit beneath the hollow structure, slowly roasting the person inside. The bronze bull of Phalaris, though Greek in origin, found echoes in Roman cruelty. The victim's screams echoed through tubes within the bull's head, transformed into the bellowing of an angry beast for the crowd's delight. Even public rape was used as execution. Women condemned to death were sometimes stripped and violated by trained animals, bears or donkeys, while the crowd watched. It was called bestial punishment, and its purpose was as much humiliation as horror. These were not hidden acts. They were midday spectacles, accompanied by vendors selling food, wine, and perfume to mask the stench of blood. Senators and commoners alike cheered, jeered, and wagered bets. To Rome, violence was a language, a method of rule. But not all victims died quickly. Some tortures dragged on for days in purpose. One of the most infamous was reserved for traitors and parricides. It was called scaphism. The Persian Empire, vast and ancient, had no shortage of brutal execution methods, but none were quite as revolting or prolonged as scaphism, sometimes known as the boats. Described in haunting detail by Greek historians, scaphism was a punishment of extreme degradation, designed not only to kill but to unmake a person through agony and filth. The condemned was stripped naked and forced into a pair of narrow wooden boats or hollowed-out tree trunks. One half encased the back, the other closed over the torso, leaving the arms, legs, head, and genitals exposed. Then, the true horror began. Honey and milk were poured over the exposed flesh, especially the face and genitals, luring insects in swarms. The prisoner was force-fed more of the same mixture daily, ensuring a constant oozing flow of diarrhea and vomit inside the tight, sweltering space of the boat. Rot set in. Flies, ants, maggots, and beetles nested in the wounds, devouring flesh slowly. The victim, unable to move, was left to fester, alive-rotting from both the outside and the inside. Days would pass, sometimes a week, sometimes two. The stench grew unbearable. Death came not from a single blow, but from sepsis, gangrene, dehydration, or madness. It was a punishment of visibility and decay, a reminder that betrayal of the king of Persia would earn you not just death, but obliteration. Few tortures throughout history matched the cruelty of scaphism in duration or psychological torment. It weaponized time and nature, turning the environment itself into an executioner. And though Persia wielded such horrors against enemies of the state, other civilizations turned inward, using pain to enforce religious obedience, crush dissent, or terrify their own citizens. Such was the case in early modern Europe, where torture chambers beneath castles and cathedrals still whispered secrets in the dark. But to find the very roots of organized torture, one must look even further back to the pharaohs, to ancient Egypt, where power was divine and pain was precise. Beneath the sun-bleached sands of ancient Egypt, a civilization flourished that gave the world pyramids, papyrus, and profound spirituality. But hidden beneath its golden image lay a network of disciplinary horrors designed to enforce the divine rule of pharaohs and to punish those who disrupted the sacred order of Ma'at, balance of truth, justice, and harmony. Egyptian society was strictly hierarchical, and with divine kingship came absolute control. The pharaoh was not a ruler in human terms, but a god in flesh, and to defy him was to defy the cosmos. And so, punishment had to be brutal enough to correct not only behavior, but cosmic imbalance. Among the most feared punishments was impalement. Though its exact methods varied by region and era, Egyptian records describe the condemned being skewered through the rectum or abdomen, raised vertically, and left to die slowly in the burning sun. The pole would miss the vital organs, ensuring the victim suffered for hours, sometimes days, before death. Impalement was reserved for blasphemers, traitors, and occasionally disloyal soldiers. Mutilation was also common, cutting off the nose, ears, or tongue as both punishment and permanent disfigurement. A thief might lose a hand, a liar his tongue. In more severe cases, offenders were blinded with hot metal rods, rendering them helpless and permanently shamed. Egyptian texts refer to the House of the Knife, a euphemism for torture chambers used by temple officials and royal guards to extract confessions or mete out punishment. These places were silent, windowless, and stone-walled, where cries would never reach the outside world. Punishments were not always public. Often, they were deliberately invisible, vanishing people into desert prisons or subterranean cells within temple complexes. Their fate would serve as a whispered warning, disappear, and be forgotten by time. One particularly horrific punishment involved being buried alive, sealed in tombs once meant for nobility, now repurposed for the disgraced. Trapped in darkness, the air would thin, and the sacred walls would become the final witnesses to a slow, suffocating death. And while Egypt mastered psychological terror as much as physical across the Aegean Sea, a civilization born of philosophy and democracy wielded pain in defensive control. In ancient Greece, pain became political. The philosophers of ancient Greece pondered ethics, virtue, and justice, but for all their enlightened thinking, Greek city-states were no strangers to cruelty, especially when it came to slaves, traitors, and the enemies of democracy. Perhaps the most infamous torture tool to emerge from this era was the brazen bull, attributed to Perilos of Athens, who presented it as a gift to the tyrant Phalaris of Agrigentum in Sicily. The concept was as horrifying as it was ingenious. A life-sized hollow statue of a bronze bull was crafted with exquisite detail, including a complex network of acoustic pipes within its head. A door was cut into its side. Victims, usually criminals or political dissenters, were locked inside, and a fire was lit beneath the belly of the bull. As the metal heated, it would slowly roast the person within. The pipes inside transformed the victim's screams into haunting bull-like bellows, echoing across the plaza. Flames licked the metal. The scent of burning flesh filled the air. It was a spectacle of sound, sight, and smoke designed not only to punish, but to entertain. Legend has it that Perilos himself was the first to die in the bull, after Phalaris decided to test the invention on its inventor. Elsewhere in Greece, exposure was used for unwanted infants, especially girls or the disabled. Newborns were left on hillsides or city outskirts shelpless, alone, and at the mercy of the elements and wild animals. Though not a formal torture in the strictest sense, it was a socially accepted horror, one that spoke volumes about the value of life in ancient times. For traitors and high crimes, the punishment could be poetic. The philosopher Socrates, convicted of corrupting youth and impiety, was sentenced to drink a cup of hemlocca, slow-acting poison. Though not physically violent, the death was deliberate and ritualized. Paralysis would climb from the feet to the chest, lungs would cease, and consciousness would fade, while the mind remained alert. A calm death, but a forced one. And while the Greeks offered poison and bulls, the neighboring Etruscans and Romans were inventing new instruments designed not just to kill, but to sustain agony. As the world aged, so did its tortures. The iron devices of medieval Europe would make all that came before seem almost merciful. With the collapse of Rome and the dawn of the medieval age, darkness crept not only across Europe's cities but into its dungeons. Torture, once a tool of spectacle or symbolic punishment, now became a quiet, systematic science hidden beneath stone keeps, cloisters, and courts of inquisition. It was no longer about public terror, but private submission. The age of iron and faith had arrived. The Catholic Church, wielding spiritual and secular power, sanctioned the use of torture to root out heresy and enforce orthodoxy. The Inquisition, particularly the Spanish Inquisition, employed methods as brutal as any battlefield. One of their favored devices was the strappado. The accused's wrists were tied behind their back, and they were hoisted by a rope attached to the ceiling, then suddenly dropped, dislocating the shoulders with a sickening crack. This could be repeated multiple times, and sometimes weights were tied to the ankles to increase the pain. It left no visible wounds, making it a clean torture in the eyes of the church, but the internal damage was immense. For those who would not confess, more creative tools were used. The rack was perhaps the most infamous, a long wooden table with rollers at both ends. The victim's wrists and ankles were tied and slowly pulled in opposite directions by a turning wheel. Muscles tore, joints snapped, tendons stretched until they ruptured like cords. Few survived intact physically or mentally. Then there was the Iron Maiden, often misunderstood in history, but chilling nonetheless. While some modern historians argue its use was exaggerated, variations of the concept existed: coffin-like enclosures with metal spikes lining the interior. Victims were closed inside, the spikes piercing the flesh in non-vital area enough to cause agony, not death, unless left too long. And for crimes of the flesh, there were devices of sexual torture, the pair of anguish being one of the most horrific. Shaped like a metallic flower bulb, it was inserted into the mouth, rectum, or vagina, depending on the nature of the offense. A screw handle would be turned, causing the petals to expand outward, tearing tissue. It was used on blasphemers, homosexuals, women accused of witchcraft, or those said to have consorted with the devil. In some dungeons, water was the weapon. Victims were force-fed gallons of water, causing the stomach to distend grotesquely. Then, executioners would stomp on the swollen abdomen, or place heavy weights atop it, bursting the organs within. And still, perhaps the most chilling method required no device at all, only patience. Known as the toka, or water torture, this early predecessor to waterboarding involved tying the victim down and pouring water slowly over the cloth, covering their mouth and nose, simulating the feeling of drowning. The panic it induced was as effective as any blade. Yet not all tortures were hidden in dungeons. Some were meant for the streets, for public humiliation and slow death. This brings us to the breaking wheel. Few tortures throughout history were as slow, as brutal, or as deliberately dehumanizing as the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel in later Christian retellings. Used across medieval and early modern Europe, particularly in France and the German states, this method was as much public theater as it was punishment. Executions by wheel were often held in the town square, where crowds gathered to watch the unfolding spectacle of dismemberment. The condemned would be brought out stripped, sometimes drugged with alcohol, to dull their resistance and laid on the ground. A large wooden cartwheel, often mounted on a tall post, was placed nearby. The executioner would take an iron bar or hammer and begin systematically smashing the prisoner's limbs, starting from the legs and working upward. The bones were not simply broken, but shattered at multiple points, so that the arms and legs could be threaded woven between the spokes of the wheel like rope through a loom. The grotesquely bent limbs made it impossible to escape or even move. The wheel was then hoisted upright, placed atop a post for all to see. The victim was left to die slowly, exposed to the elements, birds, and insects. In some cases, the executioner gave a final mercy blow to the chest or head to hasten death. In others, death took days. The wheel was a punishment for the most reviled crimes: murder, heresy, treason, arson, or the killing of a parent or priest. It was designed to be more than a sentence. It was erasure, an act so painful and public that it would burn into the minds of all who witnessed it. But for those condemned under suspicion of sorcery or communion with devils, something even worse awaited. The witch hunts of the 15th through 17th centuries birthed some of the darkest tortures ever inflicted on women in the name of purity. Next came the fire. The fires that burned across Europe during the witch hunts did more than consume wood. They consumed entire lives, communities, and generations of women, many of whom were tortured before ever being brought to the stake. Though the flames became the final act, the true horror of the witch trials lay in the dark rituals of confession and interrogation that preceded them. In Germany, where witch trials reached a fever pitch, Thumbscrews were a common tool devices that slowly crushed the bones and nails of the fingers, often until they splintered. The pain was unbearable, and the sound a sickening crunch of bone and sinew was, often enough to break even the most stalwart of hearts. Another infamous device was the witch's chera-heavy iron seat covered in hundreds of sharp metal spikes. Victims were stripped naked and strapped into it tightly. The pressure forced the spikes deep into their skin. Some versions of the chair were heated from beneath by fire, making the iron red hot, literally cooking the victim alive while they sat motionless in agony. Then there was the swimming test, rooted in the belief that water, a pure element, would reject evil. Accused witches were bound right thumb to left toe and vice versa and tossed into a body of water. If they floated, it was a sign they had rejected baptism and were therefore guilty of witchcraft. If they sank, they were innocent but often drowned before they could be pulled out. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating method was the interrogation of silence. Victims were left awake for days, deprived of food, light, and sleep, questioned constantly under threat of violence. In this state of mental and physical ruin, many began to confess to anything, including impossible claims dancing with the devil, flying on broomsticks, consorting with familiars. Once the confession was secured, the execution was ritualized. Burning at the stake was symbolic. Fire purified the soul and destroyed the body. Victims were tied to a post, surrounded by bundles of dry wood, and set aflame while alive. Often, a bag of gunpowder was tied around their necks, as a supposed mercito hastened death with an explosion, but this was not always honored. Cries for forgiveness and mercy were drowned in smoke and ash. The crowd, fed on centuries of fear and piety, watched not in horror but in satisfaction. The witch hunts claimed tens of thousands of lives, overwhelmingly women, whose only crime was midwifery, herbal knowledge, or being too outspoken in their villages. Entire regions were left scarred. But as Europe's obsession with heresy waned, a new type of torment emerged, cold, scientific, and surgical. With the Enlightenment came progress, but also new ways to dissect pain, not out of superstition, but in the name of order and observation. And nowhere was this more chilling than in the guileless hands of Imperial China. In the grandeur of Imperial China, amidst scrolls of wisdom and palaces of silk, there existed a brutal paradox. A civilization of immense culture and refinement that employed some of the most methodical and excruciating tortures in human history. At the heart of Chinese justice was lingqi, known to the Western world as death by 1,000 cuts. Reserved for the gravest offenses treason, patricide, rebellion, lingqi was not just a death sentence, but an obliteration of the body, soul, and honor. The punishment was rooted in the belief that a person must be buried whole to enter the afterlife. By dismembering the body, lingqi condemned the victim for eternity. The process was horrifyingly precise. The condemned was tied to a wooden frame. The executioner, often trained over years, would begin by slicing small pieces of flesh from the arms, chest, and legs, avoiding arteries to keep the victim alive. The face was often saved for last. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, of cuts were made. The body would bleed slowly, excruciatingly, and sometimes the final blow, often a stab to the heart, was delivered only after the spectacle was complete. Witnesses were sometimes required, victims' family members forced to attend as a warning. The punishment could be mercifully shortened by bribes. Wealthy families could pay the executioner to hasten death, ensuring only symbolic cuts were made before the final strike. The poor had no such luxury. Another feared method was the cao jia, or wooden collar, a heavy wooden board worn around the neck like stocks. Some collars were so large and heavy that victims could not feed themselves or sleep properly. They could be worn for weeks, turning the punishment into a slow death through starvation and exhaustion. And then there was bamboo torturia, form of execution that used the very growth of nature as its weapon. The condemned was tied over freshly planted bamboo shoots, and over the course of days, the sharp, resilient bamboo would grow upward, piercing the flesh and slowly impaling the body. Even in the opulence of the Forbidden City, beneath the brushstrokes of calligraphy and ritual, The empire's will was enforced through pain, legacy, and fear. Yet, even as the East refined its methods, the West would take torture to an entirely new frontier. In the name of the state, of justice, and of the crowd's desire to be entertained, the world's most organized torture system was already rising. The Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was the grandest stage on which cruelty played out not as mere punishment, but as a tool of imperial power, entertainment, and public order. From the winding streets of Rome to the farthest outposts of the empire, the spectacle of torture and execution reinforced the might of Rome's iron hand. One of the most infamous and barbaric punishments was crucifixion. Originally a punishment reserved for slaves, pirates, and enemies of the state, crucifixion was designed to maximize humiliation, prolong suffering, and broadcast power. Condemned men, often stripped naked, were forced to carry their own crossbeam to the place of execution. There, they were either nailed or tied to the wooden structure, their arms outstretched and legs bent or tied. Death was slow hours, sometimes days caused by exhaustion, asphyxiation, shock, and infection. The audience was not just the local populace, but travelers, merchants, and soldiers, a warning etched into their minds that rebellion against Rome was a path to endless suffering. Yet, crucifixion was only one element. The Colosseum, the empire's greatest amphitheater, was the site of unthinkable torments and deaths far beyond gladiatorial combat. Criminals were sometimes sentenced to die in elaborate fatal reenactments of mythological tales, their bodies mutilated or burned in scenes designed to awe and terrify. Then came the damnatio ad bestias condemnation, to wild beasts where victims were torn apart by lions, bears, and leopards. This punishment was not quick, often prolonged as animals played with their prey, much to the crowd's morbid delight. The wheel of death, while not a Roman invention, found its roots in Roman execution methods, later adapted by medieval torturers. Perhaps most cruel of all were the scaphism punishments, victims trapped between two boats, force-fed milk and honey to attract insects, left to rot alive in the blistering sun. These tortures were not hidden. They were public. They were theatrical. And they worked. Rome's dominion was secured not just by armies but by fear. But as Rome fell and the medieval era dawned, new devices and methods emerged, evolving cruelty with cold calculation. Thus, the world's darkest chapters in torture continued to unfold, each civilization inventing its own language of pain. And yet, in this vast history of human cruelty, one question remains. What drives mankind to devise such horrors, and what does it say about our own nature? The story of torture is not merely a chronicle of human cruelty. It is also a mirror held up to the depths of human psychology, fear, power, control, and the desperate attempt to impose order on chaos. Across millennia and continents, the tools and methods changed, but the impulses behind them remained hauntingly similar. Consider the psychological torment that accompanied the physical pain, the slow erosion of will, the breaking of spirit. Torture was designed not only to punish the body, but to fracture the mind, to turn friend against friend, to coerce confessions whether true or false, and to obliterate hope. Yet, even amid these horrors, stories of resilience emerged. In the depths of dungeons, in the silence of solitary confinement, prisoners clung to faith, memory, and defiance. They whispered prayers, recounted stories of better days, and sometimes found ways to outwit their tormentors. One such figure was Boethius, a Roman philosopher imprisoned by the Ostrogothic king. Though condemned and tortured, he wrote the Consolation of Philosophia masterpiece that argued for hope and reason amid suffering. The paradox of torture lies in this dance between destruction and endurance. It is a testament to the fragility and strength of the human spirit. As history marched forward, societies began to question the morality of torture. The Enlightenment sparked debates on justice and humanity, while thinkers like Cesare Beccaria argued that torture was not only cruel but ineffective and unjust. Slowly, torture was outlawed in many parts of the world, though it still persists in dark corners to this day. Yet, by studying its history, the horrifying methods, the cultural contexts, the emotional scars, we confront uncomfortable truths about power and the consequences of cruelty. The ancient world's most horrific tortures, impalement, the rack, the brazen bull, lynching, and others, are reminders of the extremes to which human beings can go when fear and authority combine. And so, as you close your eyes tonight, remember the stories carved into history's bones, not just of pain, but of survival. For in understanding the darkest chapters of our past, we hold the key to a more compassionate future. Thank you for journeying through the shadows of history. If you'd like to hear more immersive stories, please subscribe, like, and share your thoughts below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Let us know in the comments.